Hi, colleagues. I hope all is going well, that you're enjoying the holidays. I'm very much looking forward to when we get together in early January, on January 11th, for the SST retreat, the first gathering that we have in the new term. And I feel very grateful and am really happy that we'll have an opportunity to explore a little bit about the book that was recently released, and in particular, two chapters, one on mindfulness and one on listening. And so that our January 11th get together can be as rich as it can be by having us do a little bit in preparation for it, and then something that we can talk about when we're together. I wanted to take a few moments to lay the groundwork for that. In particular, the ways that we will explore mindfulness in the context of listening. So we won't be necessarily exploring, and nothing between now and when we meet will be about, lowering or closing the eyes and paying attention to the breath and all that, very important mindfulness practice. It'll be specifically about mindfulness in relationship to others through the practice of listening. And this is something that we'll talk about when we're together, and it's something that you can read about more fully in chapter 11 in particular. So I thought I would share a little bit about what you might want to have on your mind and what we might all practice for at least one day or for many days based on our interest over the course of the holidays, where mindful listening can be very useful and informative and instructive, and coming into the new year where, of course, with colleagues and with students, listening is robust. And I know that we're all pretty good listeners. That's already apparent. What we'll be exploring in particular is in some ways how to bring a little bit more of the intentional mindful awareness to aspects of our experience while listening to others that sometimes can be either very intuitive and it's happening, but we're not necessarily as cognizant of it, or really in some ways is not happening as richly as it could. So as just a little bit of a prelude for when we get together, you'll receive a PDF. Janet will send everyone a PDF of two chapters, Chapter 5 on mindfulness and Chapter 11 on listening. I think you'll find that the Chapter 5 on mindfulness will be a nice primer on mindfulness. Hopefully it'll be informative. You'll learn things that you maybe didn't know if you're familiar with mindfulness, and if you're not familiar with mindfulness, you'll be open to the world of mindfulness. But know this, Chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 are really the building blocks of understanding mindfulness as a practice. And so in Chapter 5, you'll see toward the end, as each of the chapters has a mindfulness practice, that the mindfulness practice in Chapter 5 is really a high-level practice. In some ways, it's not even a practice. So I encourage you to read Chapter 5 to find it interesting conceptually. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you do the Chapter 5 practice. Certainly, it's not something that we'll necessarily spend time exploring when we meet. The Chapter 11 practice, though, on mindful listening is something that will be at the core of what we explore when we're together. And so in its primary form, the mindful listening practice is called Do Not Interrupt, or DNI. And so I'll take a few moments and discuss what this is, and you can read about this more fully in Chapter 11. So Do Not Interrupt is both a practice or an intention and an outcome. The outcome is when you're in an interaction with somebody and you're talking with them, to not interrupt them. So it's very sort of a rigid outcome in that sense. As a practice, it's to notice what it is that we begin to experience, both in terms of our thoughts and feelings and sensations in the body, because those are the three interior aspects of our experience that oftentimes are impelling us to interrupt, or pushing us, or moving us to interrupt, or we feel the impulse to interrupt. And sometimes we're not aware of where it's coming from, and sometimes we're not even aware it's happening. We just interrupt. So the DNI, or Do Not Interrupt, as a mindfulness practice says, form the intention in advance of a conversation with somebody to not interrupt them. And then during the course of the conversation, notice the thoughts, feelings, and sensations that are arising when you feel the impulse to interrupt. And know that for many, in fact for most, you will interrupt. You'll sort of maybe even laugh at, oh my God, I can't stop myself from interrupting. Or you'll catch yourself mid-interruption or at the beginning of interrupting or maybe prior to interrupting. And you might even be aware of the impulse to interrupt before you interrupt, but you do it anyway. Or you don't for a moment, but then you sort of stop paying attention to it and then you do a moment later. So the important thing is that the outcome of not interrupting is really of secondary concern. Of course, it's nice to, in a conversation, have somebody largely listening and not interrupting, but there's much nuance to what an interruption actually entails. And there is a natural conversational back and forth that we wouldn't necessarily call interrupting unless we were rigidly looking at what an interruption is. And we might say, hey, that's an interruption. But actually, it's a very enjoyable, interactive, almost dance. And we're not interested with the do not interrupt practice to eliminate that very attuned way that we can relate to each other. In fact, to enhance that. So whether you start now with the do not interrupt, it's really nice, useful for the holidays, or whether you, a week before we meet, pick a day where you say, on that day I'm going to see what it's like to not interrupt. However you fashion for that self, that's the primary mindfulness practice that we'll be exploring, and then we'll speak to how it is that it connects with mindfulness and the other practices like placing attention on an object like the breath, and when we notice our mind wandering, returning our attention to the breath. That's something that will be talked about in Chapter 11 as well. And so I hope that that's helpful. I'm looking forward to us getting together. I'm looking forward to us exploring mindfulness in a very important, engaged and interactive form of listening. And I'm looking forward and I'm hopeful that the mindful listening conversation can help to deepen and enrich our understanding of mindfulness in the many forms it takes and in the many ways we can be a little bit more present and resilient and steady in the face of the challenging and exciting moments of our life. All right. There will be a copy of the book, a loaner copy, in room 212 for anyone who'd like to come and get it. So in addition to reading the chapter 5 and 11 in the PDF, you're welcome to just pick up the loaner copy. It's yours for as long as you feel that you'd like to hang on to it, and read the chapters there. And also you might find that chapter 1 on attention, or chapter 2 on relaxation, for example, or chapter 4 on awareness, or maybe some of the introduction on the history of mindfulness and law might be of interest to you, and so you can flip through those chapters as well. But we'll be zeroing in on chapters 5 and chapters 11. All right, hope this is helpful. Looking forward to seeing you all, wishing you all the best. Happy holidays.